What I want to do this evening, or if you're watching the US this afternoon, is deal with more than just this common apologetics question of how you fit the animals on board Noah's Ark. What you're going to hear today is the first reporting of some breaking news and scientific misconduct. So there's much larger questions that we're going to address. We're going to take the criticisms and the responses to the common creationist answers head on, and we're going to discover some very serious problems along the way. So if you haven't already guessed from what I've said, we're going to be discussing much more than this specific question. This touches on the much wider creation evolution debate. So this is something, if you're watching as a skeptic, hits at the core issues upon which this smaller question is based. So let's back up then to the larger big picture question and put this specific question in that larger context. This is survey data from the United States, and I anticipate it to be even more dramatically skewed in Europe. So if you're watching in the US, this is US number. If you're watching in Europe, this is going to be even more of a discrepancy over there, is my impression. Surveys of professional scientists, PhD scientists, on the question of evolution have given consistent answers over the years. This is from a Pew Research Forum survey from 2015. Among working PhD scientists, they overwhelmingly favor evolution. So the frequently asked survey question is, how do you think humans originated? Did they evolve over time due to natural processes? That's this particular answer up here, in which there's 91% endorsing that. Yes, humans have evolved atheistically, so to speak. This is the theistic evolution position. They've evolved by guiding by a supreme being. So a small fraction of PhD scientists hold to that. And hardly any PhD scientists say that humans have existed in their present form since the beginning of time. That tends to be the creationist answer. So virtually no one in the scientific community who has a PhD endorses it. In the US, these sorts of survey results often are mentioned in the context of lament. Lament on the parts of mainstream scientists who look at the discrepancy between their survey answers and those of the average US adult. Only a third of US adults agree with the scientific community here, and around a full third of US adults endorse what's typically been called the creationist answer. What I want to focus on, though, is just the PhD scientist question. We're going to be talking about the question of speciation, the origin of species. This touches on Noah's Ark immediately, for reasons we'll get into. But it really is a microcosm of the larger creation evolution debate. And at the end of this, at some point in your life, you have to make a decision. Which of these groups of people are you going to side with? The overwhelming majority of PhD scientists who say evolution is the answer for humans and species in general, or the tiny fraction, the fraction to which I would belong, being a PhD scientist, who say no, evolution is not the answer. What the Bible describes in Genesis 1 through 11 and thereafter provides the framework that gives us the best scientific answer. So who do you side with? And really this comes down to a question of trust. I'm a trained biologist, and I've personally handled thousands of DNA sequences. But when it comes to other fields of science, even other disciplines within biology, I'm a layperson. I'm not a trained organismal biologist. I'm not a trained medical doctor. I'm not a trained geologist. So in those other fields of science, you and I both have to say, do I spend the rest of my life trying to study it, which for me is not really an option. I've made my career choice. Or do you try to sort through and sift through the various opinions and decide who you trust? That's largely going to be the question you and I have to answer. And that's the question I want you to think about, the larger question I want you to think about this evening, whatever position you're at. So I'm coming to you as a religious professing scientist, and that's a larger question as well you have to answer. Can a devout person be a diligent scientist? Now, I've given my answer to this question and my answer to the other side. So there's a second element of what I want you to decide this evening. Whichever position you pick, it's incumbent upon you and me, because I have to make a choice as well, to explain the existence of the other side. So if you side with the overwhelming majority, then why do people like me exist? Religious bias? Are we charlatans who deliberately mislead? You have to come up with some explanation. I've published an explanation for why the overwhelming majority of scientists hold to evolution. I've done this in print several times. One of these is from several years ago. Why don't more people accept the young Earth view of speciation? And just to quote from the article, I gave the answer of ignorance. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. What I mean is, and I'm using a US example, in the US, the mainstream educational system effectively forbids the teaching of creation science in the classroom. So if you're a scientist and you know that the scientific method involves disproving competing ideas, but you've never been forced to engage competing ideas, well, then how can you scientifically reject it? The people I've run into and the literature from the evolutionists that I've read underscores this. They aren't aware of what we even hold to. You look at Jerry Coyne, Richard Dawkins, they seem to be stuck in 1859. They think modern creationists believe the same position of creationists that Darwin tried to argue against, as if nothing's changed in a century and a half. So I think there's good evidence to support my view. Whatever your view is, you need to explain the existence of the other side. That's my point. Now, I want to take this a step further. You immediately have a counter argument to my explanation. So I've said all these scientists out there, this overwhelming consensus among the scientific majority, they don't know what I actually hold to. Well, someone might say, I've got a good counter argument to that. There's this guy named Joel Duff. He's got a whole blog and a whole archive of critiques of the young Earth creationist position on speciation. So he calls it hyper-evolution. We'll talk about why he thinks that momentarily. He's got a whole set of critiques of this, scientific critiques. You can go to his website, thenaturalhistorian.com. He's a professor of biology, PhD. He's a professing Christian, member of the PCA Church. So if you're not from the US, there's multiple branches of Presbyterians in the United States. One of the more liberal wings is the PCUSA. They ordain homosexual clergy, these sorts of things. If you've heard the name Tim Keller, he's part of the PCA. So he's more conservative. On the evolution issue, he's not. He tends to be theistic evolution, but has vacillated some on the issue of Adam. My point is, Duff comes from this branch of Christendom that's not known for rank liberalism. So here's someone who's got biological training, plus claims professing Christian character to back up whatever he says. I mention him specifically because the other major players in the evolution debate do as well. They rely on his analysis when dealing with young Earth creation. So on this side of the pond, in the US, BioLogos is the main theistic evolutionary organization. I'm told basically the US equivalent of the Faraday in the UK. So BioLogos, go to their website. We present an evolutionary understanding of God's creation. Their mission is to convert the church, by and large, to this idea of theistic evolution. They claim to also try to reach out to the world, but you look at what they publish, their activity, it's focused heavily on the church. Go to their blog. When people bring up this question of, well, what about the young Earth view of speciation? Who do they cite? This is one of their forum moderators, Christy Hemphill, Joel Duff. There, as well as right here, natural historian. The naturalist historian comes up over and over again. They've published Joel Duff as a leading authority on what young Earthers say. He's got an article, Did Modern Animals Evolve from Inhabitants on the Ark? And of course, his answer is no. It's a fairly heavy-handed critique of that view. And people like Josh Swamidas, you may have heard of him, who's been camping out on the Adam and Eve issue and what genetics and science says about that. What does he say? He relies on Joel Duff. So my point is, lots of people within the creation evolution debate who are opposed to creation science rely on him. I would still argue the vast majority of evolutionists don't even bother with young Earth creation. They're ignorant of it. They think it's religion. They don't even try to touch it. Those who do delve into the apologetic side of this, those evolutionists who do decide, let's take some time to do battle, to engage the arguments that creationists are putting forth, they're relying on Joel Duff. Well, let's up the ante yet another notch. Just recently, last month, it was announced in May of this year, 2020, Joel Duff and two other authors published a peer-reviewed paper. So in the technical scientific literature, they've put their critiques of young Earth creation science in print. They say what I hold to, what Simon holds to, what Answers in Genesis holds to is a recent invention. It doesn't come from the Bible. It was invented, here's the connection to Noah's Ark, to solve the problem of fitting animals on board the ark. I still haven't described exactly what this view is. I will in a moment. They call it, point 3 here, hyper-speciation. They say we hold to a very aberrant, wild, far-out view of how species form. We hold to this far-out view because we've got this other problem we need to solve. And in supposedly solving the problem of fitting animals on board the ark, we've created a new one, forming a whole bunch of species in a short amount of time. They go on to criticize in sort of a backhanded and also explicit way. They criticize it as being self-contradictory. We'll talk through some of the specific examples here momentarily. And they say the position that I now hold to and others hold to actually ends up leading people towards evolutionary biology. So they say, here's what you need to do as educators. Teach the creationists how the creationists' views themselves have evolved. And once they see that modern Yarth creation is basically rediscovering the basic principles of evolution, this will give the students cognitive dissonance. And they'll say, wait a minute, what in the world do I actually hold to? And if my creationist view actually allows this much speciation, what is the difference between my view and evolution? And it'll soften them to the idea of evolution. So before we dive into this further, we're going to return to this at the end. Let's go back to the question of how do you fit the animals on board Noah's Ark? And I want to begin by helping all of us feel the weight of this objection. Because if you're a student, or if you're a grandparent or parent who has students who are eventually going to go off to the classroom, this is what they're going to encounter at some level, almost guaranteed. And I'm going to approach this from a specific perspective. The question really involves both extinct species, like dinosaurs, and living ones. I'm going to focus on the latter because just focusing on the latter gives you enough weight to feel why skeptics find such objection to the idea of Noah's Ark and of taking the scripture plainly on this front. So let's think through exactly how many living species exist on Earth and why the skeptic thinks this is such an unsolvable problem for creationists of lay level and PhD alike. Think about how much exists in the ocean. Take a look at this image and how many animals are present here, from corals and sponges and fish of various colors. And don't miss these light green fish over here. There's a lot present in a coral reef. There's a lot of life present, a lot of species present. There's a lot of life in the ocean. How many types of octopi exist, as an example? Octopi and other creatures like them, like squid or cuttlefish. Those are over 800. So that's something to consider. Just octopi, squid, these types of creatures alone, over 800 different types. Well, what about sea life in general? What about crustaceans, lobsters, crabs, so forth? How many of those exist on planet Earth right now? Living examples. Over 40,000 species. So that ups the ante as you think about how much life exists. Let's up it even further. How many types of arthropods exist? So just think of arthropods as having skeletons on the outside. We're vertebrates, classified as vertebrates. We have our skeleton on the inside of our bodies. Bees, butterflies, spiders, scorpions, those sorts of things have skeletons on the outside. How many types of these creatures exist? Pick a specific subgroup. How many different types of spiders? And I'm leaving this up because it makes us uncomfortable, myself included. So let's move on. How many different types of spiders live on planet Earth? These pictures gross me out, but we need to think about them because it represents part of the biological diversity on Earth. Like crustaceans, over 40,000. As you're falling asleep over there in the UK, because it's nearly bedtime, you can think about this as you're drifting off to sleep. 40,000 different types of spiders crawling around the Earth. How many different types of butterflies exist? I've shown a lot just on this one screen, and even more on this screen, but we wouldn't be able to show them all, even in this hour, because there's over 150,000 different types of butterflies alone on Earth. Well, what about beetles? They've often been a subject of scorn and ridicule, especially in the context of this debate. Why? Because there's over 300,000 different types of beetles. I realize I've used the comma here. This may be the period in UK, but 300,000 is what I'm trying to communicate. in US terms. Massive diversity. Let's step back, though, to the realm of something more familiar, the stuff you see at zoos. What I want you to feel and see is that there's more diversity even among the familiar creatures than we're probably comfortable with or familiar with. So how many different types of elephants do you see on this screen? You've been to enough zoos, and if there's even kids watching, they'll probably say, oh, there's two. There's the African elephant on the left with its large distinctive ears and distinctive head shape, and the Asian elephant on the right with its smaller ears and distinctive skull shape there as well. How many different types of elephants exist in this screen? Similarities are more obvious. Ear size is similar, but if you look closely, there's still something distinctive about this guy on the right, and it is now classified as a separate species. It's the African forest elephant, the one on the left being the African savanna elephant. The forest elephant is, as the name might imply, smaller. If you're trying to rumble through the jungle and the bush, it helps to be smaller so you're not constantly bumping into trees. Okay, big deal. We think of two types of elephants, there's a third. What difference does it make? Well, that's just the beginning. How many different types of giraffes are there? For years, they've been classified as a single species. But if you set various individuals next to one another, the differences become immediately apparent. Look at the coat patterns. In this guy versus this guy versus this guy. Look at the different shades of brown. Look at these guys that almost make you think they're albinos. Their underlying color is so light colored with the brown patches on top. There's debate right now in the scientific literature. They've done a genetic study several years ago, and now they're saying there's about 4 different types of species of giraffe. That's probably more than we're used to thinking about. How many different types of deer? And this is where it gets really interesting. If you're in the US and you're a hunter, you might say, well, two major ones, white-tailed deer and the mule deer, favorite hunting targets. Well, what about the deer family? Hunter, okay, yeah, maybe elk, forgot about that guy, part of what we hunt as well. And if you're in Europe, caribou, reindeer, okay, forgot about that one. Moose, something to remember as well, part of the deer family. Here's a European deer. Okay, have I expanded your repertoire of how many different types of deer there are? What if we keep going and don't limit our focus to the US and Europe, but look all around the globe at the various species of deer that exist? I'm going to guess you're seeing images and coat patterns and antler shapes and types that you haven't seen before. There's a tremendous amount of diversity in the deer family, more than we're used to thinking about. So deer is something I'm going to guess all of us have some level of familiarity with. You've seen them in zoos, maybe you've gone hunting, but you've never stopped to think about, well, how many different types are there on Earth? And there's a lot of them. There's many New World species that I don't bother to think about. Some of these you look at and you say, is that real? Is that a cross between a dog and a deer? Is that fake? No, these are real species. Some of them are quite odd and unusual, but they're all part of the deer family. Some of them you think wonder if they're a cross between a vampire and a deer. They've got these tusks. They exist, real deer species. All part of the deer family. Even this guy, which again looks like, what, a cat deer? It's strange. It's part of the deer family. This is not. And if I show these to you in sequence and I say, which one is part of the deer family, you might say neither before this presentation because they are so unusual looking. We've taken a subtle shift from the deer family to the bovid family, the family which includes cattle, antelopes, and other species. Let's walk through this family. How many different types of bovids exist? These are duikers. These are different types of duikers and different species of duikers that roam heavily in Africa. Some that even look like they're a cross between a duiker and a tiger. They exist. The number of small antelope-like creatures, duikers and such, boggles the mind. And what I've shown you may have already blown your mind. I didn't even know these were in the bovid family. There's a huge amount of diversity in it. And again, the point of all this is to help you feel the weight of the objection. How do you fit all these animals on board Noah's Ark? And what I want you to see is that there are far more species alive on Earth than we're used to thinking about. And this is going to get tedious because there are so many species of antelopes and impala and different types of bucks and water bucks and bush bucks and so forth that roam the planet. Gazelles, some of you may recognize scimitar-horned oryx, different species here and here. If you look at their hind haunches, there's a different patterning. They're classified as separate species. Rowan antelopes, sable antelopes. There's a huge amount of diversity. There's different types of hartebeest creatures, which are classified in the same subgroup as wildebeests, of which 2 species exist. There's, of course, the cattle representatives, small and large, the water buffalo in Asia and in Africa, different types of Asian water buffaloes, like the gaur. There's the American bison. There's the musk ox. There's the takin, which looks like a cross between a wildebeest and cattle and sheep and who knows what. There's the European bison, or the wisent. There's another bovid that looks like it's a cross between a cattle and an antelope. You don't know what to make of it. There's elands, the common one, the giant one, all part of the bovid family. And if this is getting tiring, that's what I want you to feel. There's way more than we can fit in our heads. And this is what the skeptics are thinking of. This is what the skeptics are talking about when they're saying, how do you fit all of this? And guess what else is in the bovid family? Sheep and goats. And there's many different types of them. Some that look like they're from Star Wars based on the shape of their noses. It's just incredible, the amount of diversity that exists on this planet. How are you going to make space for all of these creatures on board Noah's Ark? Ibexes, so forth. On and on we go. And if you're tired of it again, good. That's the point, that you feel the weight of fitting all these animals on board Noah's Ark. I'm tired of it, so I'm trying to fast forward through these quickly. I've shown you about 150 species, less than that, in the deer and bovid families. Over 190 species, living species, exist. How do you fit them on Noah's Ark? What about bears? One on the right may not be quite so familiar. They're popular zoo creatures. There's 8 species. How many of you could have told me exactly how many exist in this family? And this isn't to test you. It's a, how much do we really think of when we say, of course they could have fit on Noah's Ark? What about the raccoon family and the quaddy family? 14 species. What about the cat family, from lions to house cats? 37 species, living species. What about the weasel and mink family? Mustelidae is the scientific name. 58 species. What about the marsupials? They have several families in the marsupial group, from kangaroos to opossums. Over 330. What about primates? Everything from the great apes to lemurs, eyes, over 400. What about bats? Creatures that exist on the land, land dependent. We don't think about them much, often nocturnal, over 1,100. How about rodents? We try not to think about them because they're pests by and large, over 2,000. And what I've shown you so far in terms of the familiar creatures represent mammals. We haven't even touched reptiles like gharials and alligators and crocodiles, or lizards, also reptiles, and snakes and turtles of various exotic types and shapes. Over 10,000 living reptile species exist. What about amphibians, frogs, and salamanders of various shapes and colors? Even exotic creatures like caecilians. These are backboned creatures, not worms, amphibians. Over 7,000 amphibian species. How about birds? From birds of prey that we might be familiar with, vultures and hawks and eagles, and familiar ones, unfamiliar ones, close by ones, far away ones, exotic tropical ones, over 10,000 species. Altogether, in terms of just living species, there's 1.6 million. That's the skeptical argument against Genesis 6 through 9. How do you fit 1.6 million species on board Noah's Ark? It just seems ridiculous to them. End of discussion. Why would we even take this seriously? So what's the answer? Well, if you're familiar with Young Earth Creation Ministry, You can think of several probably off the bat. The best place to start is with the text of Scripture. What does it actually say? Many accusations of error against young earth creationists come from sloppy reading, not from a serious evaluation of the text. Well, the Bible describes the dimensions of Noah's Ark, 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. These are not terms we typically use today, but if you convert them to things we are familiar with, like feet. Ark is 510 feet long, 51 feet high. In terms of US yellow school buses, if that's something that's a point of reference for you, 12 buses long, stacked on top of each other, 4 high and 10 side by side wide. What matters though is volume. It's got 3 decks in it. So again, in terms of a US tractor trailer, which the UK term might be lorry, but what do I know? I'm a dumb Yankee. 483 of these is the volume of the Ark. And what I recommend is the best way to appreciate the sheer size is to come to the Ark Encounter in northern Kentucky, where we've built a full-scale replica model so that you can experience just how massive this ship is. So that's the first point. This is a big ship. Second point, what does Noah actually bring on board? What does God say he should bring on board? And I'm bringing these points up because many skeptics don't bother to even research the most fundamental and basic points of what the text says. Birds after their kind, animals after their kind, creeping thing. Genesis 7 goes on to clarify that which has the breath of life. In case it's not obvious, this does not include fish. The cartilaginous ones like the sharks, like this whale shark, mammals, swimming mammals like sperm whale and other such, porpoises, dolphins, whales, manta rays, anything in the sea, shrimp and sea urchins, the octopi. None of that falls into what needs to go on board the Ark. After all, it's a flood. They survived in the water. Many of them die, but if the point for survival on land is just to have a pair, well, you can accomplish that without building an Ark. Noah doesn't need a big aquarium. So that removes from our list of 1.6 million species, tens of thousands of them. Now, there's debate among Bible scholars whether or not insects and the like and arthropods have the breath of life in them. And this isn't simply a Genesis 6 through 9 question. You have to answer that question in the context of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, where there's no death before sin. Does that extend to ants, which are a type of arthropod? If Adam and Eve are going for a walk, do they have to watch their every step so they don't step on an ant or swat a mosquito? Was there a mosquito back then? These are the types of questions that are relevant long before you get to the question of the Ark. My feeling is, based on the people I've talked to and read, no, they're not included in this breath of life. Even if they are, though, they're small and take up very little space. So this massive number of species, over 1 million, is either not included or a very small size. What that leaves in terms of large animals are the mammals like elephants, the reptiles like lizards and snakes and such, the amphibians, frogs and salamanders and so forth, and birds. And in terms of living species, that's only about 34,000, roughly, which represents only 2% of the 1.6 million that we looked at earlier. That's a dramatic reduction. What's perhaps the most important term, though, is this phrase, birds after their kind, animals after their kind. People think of it after its kind. Genesis 6 and 7 say the purpose of bringing these on board is to keep what? Bring male and female, to keep, in the New King James, species alive. That's a mistranslation. Species is a modern term. Other Bible English translations use a different term. My New King James Version actually has a little note by that and says, literally the Hebrew means seed, and that's a better translation. The same Hebrew word is translated in Genesis, I think it's 13, as offspring. God makes the promise to Abraham that to you and to your, I give this land. He doesn't give it to his species. It doesn't make sense in context. To his offspring. So the point is to keep the offspring of each kind alive. You bring male and female on board, and that implies then a means by which you can test which animals today belong to the same group, the same kind. Well, isn't species defined as reproductive compatibility? Yes and no. There's a lot of different definitions for species. Horses, donkeys, and zebras, there's about 7 different total species of these, yet they can interbreed. The offspring are almost always sterile, but that's a fairly advanced result in the spectrum of biological incompatibility. This is my point. There's all sorts of ways two individuals are unable to breed. They may have different mating rituals. If they're birds, different mating calls, and they never even mate. Some might mate, but the specific molecules on the surface of sperm and egg aren't a match, and so sperm and egg never fuse. Sperm and egg might fuse, but then the embryo doesn't implant, if you're a mammal, placental. It may implant, but can't come to term. There's all these points at which this process could break down. So to actually get to the stage of having a healthy adult live offspring, albeit one that's sterile, is a huge success by those standards. So I'm comfortable saying this is good criteria for saying these separate species are part of the same kind. Thinking of this criteria of male and female. You've got hybrids between lions and tigers, forming ligers. Lions and tigers are considered separate species. To summarize a large body of breeding work, a general rule of thumb has emerged. Species does not seem to be a good approximation for the biblical kind. Genus does not seem to be one either, but probably family, maybe even higher. I discuss it at length in an article I'll reference in a moment. It's a good positive test for identifying who's part of the same kind. It's not a good negative test for knowing who's not. And in my book, Replacing Darwin, I talk about ways we can be rigorous about this. And in the article I'll reference in a moment, I talk about biblical parameters about where approximately the kind boundary is. What this means practically then, not genus, not species, but family is the level at which kind is. This has huge implications for fitting animals on the ark and for the formation of species. So I've used the example here of the dog family. In the dog family, there's wolves, foxes, coyotes, dogs of various breeds and shapes and sizes. The family level includes them all. And I'm saying this implies God created representatives of this family in the beginning, and Noah brought on board the ark representatives of the dog family, not two foxes, two wolves, two dogs, but two representatives. And from those two came the species that we see today. Let's use an easy example, one that has very few species in it. We just talked about the compatibility in terms of breeding among zebras, horses, donkeys. Well, there's 3 recognized species of zebras today. The plain zebra has stripes that cross the belly. Mountain zebra does not have stripes that cross the belly, neither does the imperial zebra. This guy's stripes on his haunches look different from this guy's. The point is they're distinguishable morphologically, also genetically. Among horses and donkeys, there's 4 recognized species, 1 horse and 3 ass species, 2 Asian ass species, the onager and the kiang, 1 African one. Notice the stripes on its legs. The Przewalski's horse went extinct in the wild. It's been reintroduced. It also occasionally has a stripe or 2 on its back leg. I've even emailed my local zoo, the zookeepers, about it. They have a Przewalski's horse. You can see it. I'm saying what this biblical derivation implies is Noah brought 2 representatives of the horse family on board the ark. That pair, being unclean, came in twos, stepped off the ark, and then the last 4,500 years since the flood, these 7 new species have formed. It gets even more wild when you think about, let's say, the bird species in families. Based on breeding and breeding successes, there's a huge number of species that exist within kinds among birds. For example, these 7 species belong to the same kind, and they're just a small fraction of that kind. Based on breeding, this sparrow finch kind includes over 1,000 modern bird species. Again, I go into this derivation biblically in great detail in this article, Which Animals Were on the Ark with Noah. What I show is that the contention of that paper that I referenced early on at the beginning of this presentation is historically inaccurate. This is not a recent invention that's invoked to solve the problem of fitting animals on board the ark. We started with the question of how to fit animals on board the ark, and it so happens that what the Bible teaches allows a very easy solution to it. Bringing families on board the ark is very easy. You can see other stuff we published that justifies that conclusion in great detail. To say that it was a recent invention is problematic for a number of reasons. Again, you can see the strict biblical justification in this article. The idea in Darwin's day was not derived from the Bible. It was derived from simple observations. For example, think about the various fox species, the red fox. And if you're watching in Europe, it might be familiar to you. It's found in Eurasia. It exists in temperate environments. Its coat color is a great camouflage to our eyes. And human observers seeing this sort of pattern would say, well, it seems like it's designed for a temperate environment. Doesn't seem so well designed for a snowy Arctic environment, but when you go to the Arctic, what do you find? Lo and behold, an Arctic fox whose features seem to match the environment in which it exists, helps it to camouflage, harder to spot at a glance, blends in very well, as if it was designed to live in the Arctic environment. So it's not a conclusion based on Scripture. Scripture doesn't use the term species in Hebrew. What you do to reach that conclusion is you just say, okay, I look out here and seems like it fits its environment. Why wouldn't it have been designed by God for that environment? What's the most damning indictment of Joel Duff's accusation and so-called history of the young earth creation movement is the very beginning of the modern discussion of species. So let me back up and give us some perspective here. Is the modern young earth creationist view on species a recent invention? In one sense, the answer is yes. In the same way that the Christian position on the internet is a recent invention. It's not because the Bible's changed, it's because the internet wasn't in existence until the recent past. So of course, our specific position on the internet is a recent invention. The principles behind it are ancient. Same thing holds here. When we're talking about the modern view on what species are and how species form, you cannot have that discussion or a position on it until Linnaeus invents the term. So by definition, every single person's position on species is a recent invention because the subject itself is recent. Here's the shock. So my point is, every person's position is as recent as Linnaeus or more recent. It can't be, by definition, more recent than that or more ancient than that, because that's when the term starts. Our modern term starts with him. Well, here's what most people don't know, creationists and evolutionists. Linnaeus himself held to something very close to the modern view. Early in his career, he thought that God created species, like so many people did in Darwin's day. Later in life, because of increasing amounts of hybrid and breeding data, this is what he held to. He proposed that dog, wolf, and fox belonged to the same created genus. They were products of hybridization. Well, today we classify dog, wolf, fox, at least the fox in a separate genus from the wolf. So essentially what Linnaeus is describing is species belonging to the same family being part of the same kind. That's the modern view. And so you have the modern creationist view from the very beginning of this debate. It can't get older than Linnaeus. That's when the debate starts. So there's an error that they make in their narrative. It's a common error, and it's a error that they want to make. I should say it's a position that they want to hold to. So I can understand why they make this error all the time. And I'll get to more on why that is in a moment. But just to wrap up our earlier discussion here, fitting animals on board the ark, the answer is it's very easy because the ark is big. The number of animals God commands Noah to bring on board the ark is only a small fraction of the total. It's 2% of the 1.6 million living species. It doesn't increase much more if you add the extinct. And of course, the key concept of kinds, which comes from the Bible, not because creationists are trying to solve some sort of existential problem for the scriptures. That fits the animals very easily. Noah's only going to bring less than 2,000 kinds on board the ark. They fit quite well. So the 6 points that I raised earlier from this peer-reviewed paper, species from kinds is not a recent invention. It takes some digging to find the history, to find that Linnaeus changed his view. Even Darwin himself, I'm told, didn't discover until later in his career and that Linnaeus had changed his view. So it's obscure history, but let's get the facts straight. This idea of kinds was not invented to solve this intractable problem. So let's remove those from the discussion and move on to their next point. Does it create a new problem? Let's deal with it. Let's take the bull by the horns. So even if that history is wrong, their point would still be, so what? It helps their narrative. They want to say, see, these creationists have had this long history of problems. They started off dumb and stupid, trying to figure out how to fit the animals on board Noah's Ark. Then the number of species that we knew grew dramatically since Linnaeus, and we thought, oh no, how are we going to fit them on board the Ark? And so we had to invent this concept of kinds to solve it. We escaped that problem, and their point, of course, is now we've got a new one. Well, the narrative is wrong, but their objection is worth still considering. And I'll discuss what I mean by this hyper-speciation problem. Let's explore it further. I said 34,000 species came from the animals on board the ark, and I've just said about 2,000 or less, maybe 1,400 kinds were brought on board the ark. What that implies is tens of thousands of new species have formed in a short period of time. So skeptics, once they finally understand what creationists hold to, say, you're nuts. You hold to more evolution than Darwin does. Not even Darwin thought species formed this fast. That's crazy. That's their objection. We've got this new problem, hyper-speciation. How do you get so many species in a few thousand years? I'm not going to get into the technical detail. If you love that sort of stuff, you can read the technical papers. The main paper that describes and justifies a very testable, predictable answer to this is found in this paper. You can find it on our website, Answers in Genesis. If you're watching this presentation, you can just pause it. It's a long title, but it's easy to find it on the internet. The most comprehensive answer to this question that deals also with the comprehensive evolutionary evidence is my book, Replacing Darwin. Again, if you want the technical answer, find it there. Let's just, in very broad, oversimplified terms, see what I'm talking about. The major difference between what Darwin proposes and what creationists propose in terms of forming new species has to deal with where do you get the genetic information for it. So it's obvious on the screen, these 7 species look different. They look different ultimately, biologically, because they have different DNA sequences. The DNA encodes, it's the instruction manual for saying, okay, you get stripes, you don't, or you get a few stripes, or just a stripe on the back, like it's in the DNA. And there's genetic differences among them, millions of genetic differences among these species. The major difference scientifically, in terms of genetics and forming new species between creation and evolution is, where do those differences come from? And the answer I propose is the vast majority God created in the first kinds. They're not the product of mistakes. And what the evolutionists say is, no, they're all the product of mistakes. And actually, if you read the article by Duff, they conflate the two on a couple of occasions and try to ram the creationist view through the evolutionary model as if to fit a square peg in a round hole, and it doesn't work, and it becomes logically contradictory. But that's it in a nutshell. And this is how it works then. How do you get these various species from just a common pair on board the ark? Well, let's think of the question of how they looked. And again, oversimplify the genetics just to understand the potential that exists for forming new species in short order with God creating pre-existing differences. So stripes is a major differentiating factor between these various species. Zebras have a lot of them. The African wild ass has a few of them. And the Asian wild asses and the Przewalski's horse have slim to none. So let's think about that. And for sake of simplicity and argument, let's say the information for stripes is encoded, and we denote the genetic information encoding stripes with capital letters. So think back to high school genetics. I'm using a US term there, I think. Pre-university genetics, Punnett squares, these sorts of things. That's what we're going to do. Stripes, capital A, capital B, solids, lowercase a, lowercase b. What if you had an ancestor who was all lowercase letters? So if they're all lowercase letters, what that means is there's no information for stripes. They probably look like a Przewalski's horse. And I've got 2 copies of each A and B because all of us have DNA from both parents. And it's not that dad contributes the information for the left leg and mom for the right leg and dad for the left ear and mom for the right ear. Both contribute information for your entire body, and it's the interplay between the 2 instruction manuals that leads to our specific features. And we don't fully understand to this day exactly how that works. It's still a matter of research, but that's why we look like a mix of our parents. Well, if these guys are the ancestors on board the ark, the only thing they can pass on is lowercase letters. So you do the Punnett square, and you quickly find out that if all you have is lowercase letters in the parents, all you have is lowercase letters in the offspring, and all you have is more solids. That doesn't solve the problem. That doesn't give you zebras from the ancestors, just more horses. Well, what if you take the opposite extreme? You put zebras on board the ark, all uppercase letters by definition, because they have stripes. Well, again, use the Punnett square. If all you have is uppercase letters to pass on, all you have is uppercase letters in the offspring, which means all you have is stripes in the offspring. You don't get horses from zebra ancestors. All you get is more zebras. What if you have something that looks something along the lines of this Zorse and Zonkey? So the one on the left, and I didn't mention this earlier, I apologize. The one on the left is a cross between a horse in a zebra. It's a zorse. We have this in our Creation Museum petting zoo, so let that be an incentive to come. I think they're some of the prettiest animals in the world. You can see them live and in person. Also here in Northern Kentucky by the Ark Encounter. On the right is the zonkey, cross between a zebra and a donkey. And you can see they're partially striped. They look like a mix of these two species. By definition, they have information for solids and for stripes, so they have a mix of genetic letters. Now use the Punnett square to find out what sort of genetic potential they have if they could have offspring. And what I'm not saying is there were these sterile individuals on board the Ark. I'm saying you have to dial the clock backwards to a prior state, several thousand years old, in which they still had reproductive potential, plus this mix of information for stripes and solids. What's so remarkable about this is, if you start drawing out the potential types of offspring, what you discover is, in a single generation, you can produce the entire spectrum of horse, zebra, and donkey diversity, like that, in a heartbeat. So this problem of hyper-speciation is solved in an instant when you have pre-existing differences. And I go through great excruciating technical scientific detail in Replacing Darwin in those papers. This isn't just something I'm inventing out of whole cloth to solve this problem. It makes testable predictions. It reverses the clock on 40 years of legal decisions against young Earth creation science. It's a bombshell. And I'm not trying to overstate it. It is a big deal, which is why those critics who take the time to try to investigate what we're saying should be dealing with it and claim to deal with it. That's how you can produce it. So they say this creates new problems. The book shows how that problem is solved. Now, my book was published in 2017, the paper in 2016. This article is from 2020. And they say that our attempts to solve this lead to self-contradictions. Contradictions that end up leading to evolution. The sixth point is just a practical application they make for their colleagues. I want to focus on points 4 and 5. How is it that these people who are familiar with what we say justify these conclusions? And again, the bigger question we're trying to answer is, who do you trust? And once you pick a side, I side with the majority of scientists, I side with a small minority, how do you explain the others? And I've tried to explain the other side, the vast majority of scientists, by saying they're ignorant of what we say. Well, here's a group of folks who published a peer-reviewed paper who should be familiar with what we say, and they found problems. What do? I want to give you some backstory first. Joel Duff is one of 3 authors. The middle author is one of his former students, and the third author is David McMillan, who used to write for Answers in Genesis. So surely he should know what young Earth creationists believe. And now he's left that view, obviously. So I've proposed that these guys, the vast majority of scientists, don't know what young Earthers believe. They're ignorant of what we say. They're not trained in our methods and our principles. But this guy obviously is. Well, there's a prior history I personally have had with him, young Earth creationists have had with him, beyond just him writing for us. Not surprisingly, he's been rather vocal in his criticism of young Earth creation science. Joel Duff has published him on his own blog. So again, Joel Duff being the major person other people cite, has himself published David McMillan. When I first wrote this article series on the origin of species after the flood, it was after I published my 2016 paper. McMillan wrote a critique on the blog Panda's Thumb. And when I wrote my article, Why Don't More People Accept the Young Earth View of Speciation, I engaged what David McMillan wrote in response to one of these articles. So I said, a recent article on the Panda's Thumb blog has attempted to rebut my conclusions. The author, McMillan, comes with significant creationist and scientific credentials. Self-described as an author, engineer, and researcher who formerly wrote for Answers in Genesis before obtaining his degree in physics, he should know what we say. Remarkably, the manner in which he tries to criticize my article reveals much more about him and evolutionists in general than it does about my data. So in this article on the Panda's Thumb, and you can go to my article, find the links to all this. This is not something I'm trying to obscure and mask. You can fact check all of this. He quotes my article saying, once the animals stepped off the ark, their reservoir of DNA, like I just described, little a, capital A, little b, big B, would have easily translated into a massive amount of morphological change, like I said, in a single generation. Huge solution to what they call a problem. McMillan says This claim is clear, concise, well-defined. Jeanson could go on to provide evidence for this claim or make verifiable predictions associated with it, but he doesn't. Now, of course, the web article I was writing was a lay-level summary of this paper that I linked to multiple times. This paper, if you're not familiar with scientific papers, they have a typical structure. They have an abstract, that's the first paragraph summary of the entire paper. Then they introduce the topic, they describe the methods that are used, they give the results of the discussion and conclusion. And the materials and methods are there so that anyone can try to reproduce what's been going on. In the abstract, again, the first paragraph of the paper, the last sentence, I say, our model significantly advances the young Earth creation explanation of the origin of species, and it makes testable prediction. And if you read the paper, you'll find lots of them. Macmillan says that I could have made testable predictions, but I don't. So I think the charitable explanation of this is the guy never bothered to click on the link and read the first paragraph of the paper. Sloppy research. Well, lo and behold, Joel Duff, when David Macmillan published his article, enthusiastically endorsed David Macmillan's shoddily researched article. So there's some backstory for you. What have they done to correct their errors now, 4 years later, since I mentioned them by name, and they're engaging what we're writing? These are two of the main authors. If you want to find the answers to some of the specific things they're saying, you can go to an article I wrote 4 years ago that directly responds to Joel Duff's BioLogos article. Why would I refer you to a 4-year-old article when they just published this paper in 2020? Because evolutionists do what they always do, and they don't bother to engage what we write, and they haven't changed their arguments. They don't even reference this article, which is about 10,000 words long, I think, point by point to Duff, and their arguments haven't changed. So there you have it. You can go find the rebuttal there. But I'm not going to stop there. I said this is the place where we're going to announce some news on a deeper issue, what I'm calling scientific misconduct. That's a serious accusation. So I said in this article at the end, I said, in summary, evolutionists are unaware of our scientific literature, and even when they become aware, like Joel Duff and David Macmillan, they appear to prefer ignorance of the key scientific details. And so in one sense, their article from 2020 just is same song, 300th verse. They aren't engaging what we write. I'll get into the counter arguments momentarily. I want to set up, though, this new news, serious news, in this way. Joel Duff announced his new article, his new peer-reviewed article with Macmillan on his blog. He said, I would like to direct you to a peer-reviewed paper. Now, why am I bringing up this announcement? Because Duff, in his announcement blog post, went into some length and detail why this was so significant. So I'll let him tell you why this is such a big deal. Here's the section, the importance of peer review. This is what he's talking about. I've used this term several times without explaining it. Let him explain it. The one reason to persist through the potentially long peer review process is that once published, the work is more easily cited by academics and thus has a longer shelf life and potential for an enduring legacy. I still haven't told you what peer review is. He will in a moment. But notice, part of the reason for not just doing another blog post, of which he has many, is it has a legacy now, and it's cited by academics. So it can go a long way. So something to pay attention to. But the most important reason, he says, to pursue publishing in a peer-reviewed journal is the process of peer review itself. So what this means is you have other PhDs, experts in the field, going line by line through your paper, checking your facts, checking the sources, checking the methodology, perhaps repeating some of what you're doing, and saying, nope, here's where you're wrong, or here's where you're right. Harsh. Duff says it's a great way to be able to say what I want. It's great to be able to say what I want in a blog, but when multiple reviewers are fact-checking and putting your ideas under a microscope, the sentence ends there, but I think his point is this makes it more rigorous. Add an additional 2 authors, so it's Duff plus his other student plus Macmillan, with new eyes, new perspectives on the topic, and the process raises the odds that the final product will be more accurate and stand the test of time. And then he describes what happened. In the case of our published paper, we received considerable feedback from each of our reviewers. And I bring this up because Duff has written about peer review extensively elsewhere on his blog, and specifically in the context of criticizing young Earth creationists. You can go to his blog and Google peer review yourself and get up find a bunch of articles. Here's one example. When peer review lets you down, a young Earth creation quote problem. So this is what he laments, just as one example of his critiques and his emphasizing this peer review and the need for it for young Earth creationists. Where are the fact checkers in the young Earth creationist organizations? Why do simple errors and profound misconceptions of science persist among their ranks? So this is what he's saying. This is a serious problem. The problem is we have either non-experts writing or we have experts being reviewed by non-experts. We don't have good people fact-checking. And what makes it even more of a serious problem, we make the claim as creationists that our work is peer-reviewed, and we want to portray our work as being vetted and more accurate. So he said, and so with that background, that's why this paper is all the more significant. Duff says, we've gone through the peer review process. It's a fairly robust critique of what young Earth creationists believe. Lots of references to young Earth literature. So it should make us sit up and pay attention. What does he say specifically, though? Again, I've been leaving us in suspense, saying, how is this self-contradictory? So he says our view of hyperevolution, so to speak, leads to evolution, essentially. We're rediscovering the basic principles of evolution. They criticize how we identify kinds and such. Again, with a poor factual basis, you can look at the articles I've referenced earlier to see the factual derivation of the history and how we came about it. And my book and such, which not surprisingly never gets referenced in this paper, for the details. But this is where it gets even deeper. And here's where you get to some serious issues. Quote from their paper here. Part of their justification for saying that our view of hyper-speciation, that many species form after the flood, that view is self-contradictory. They recognize, they've cited that paper from 2016. So you remember that Dave McMillan criticized a lay-level article, apparently never read the abstract of the 2016 paper. Well, apparently now they have, and they quote from it. And they quote from it to say, look, even young Earth creationists themselves realize they've backed themselves into a corner. So here it is. Jeanson and Lyle recognize yet another challenge to the post-creationist paradigm. Post-creationist is what they're calling me in Answers to Genesis, this so-called new view. They've identified no breaks or barriers to prevent the eventual emergence of species so different that if compared would certainly be viewed as representing different original kinds. It's a mouthful of a sentence. Here's the quote from our paper. Hence, robust young Earth creation explanations for the origin of a vast number of species must explain not only how genetic mechanisms produce many phenotypes, which is just the visible features of creatures, but also how these processes did not transform one kind into another. Let me diagrammatically explain these long sentences. What Duff and colleagues are saying is this. Early on in creationism, creationists held to the view that God created species. Then this problem arose. How do we fit the species on board the ark? Well, let's back it up a little bit to family. And he says now we've got an even bigger problem. Our methods for explaining the formation of new species within families really could lead to the change of one kind into another. So of course, creationists say you can't change one kind into another. That's something I should emphasize right here. Again, I didn't mention it earlier. We believe that God created kinds. You can form new species within kinds. You can't change one kind into another. And Duff is saying, that's the new problem. Your claim, your mechanism, creationists, for forming new species inevitably forces you to acknowledge that new kinds can form. It's pushing you closer and closer to evolution. And see, Jeanson himself recognizes. So this is not personal, it's just he's the leading voice in criticizing young Earth creationists. And he's saying people like myself are admitting we've got a problem. So where does that quote come from? I'm pleased to announce that this quote goes beyond the abstract. They've read more than that. This quote about that the young Earth explanations must explain how speciation starts and stops, there must be limits to it, comes from the introduction. So they've made it that far. What they don't cite in their paper is the key counter argument. So their claim is young Earth creationists themselves are admitting there's an unsolvable problem. The way we explain the formation of new species has to eventually lead to the formation of new kinds. And we admit we don't know how to solve it. See, quote from their paper. they don't tell you is that in the results and discussion section later in the paper, for example, this whole section right here and more does exactly that. So just to give you some quotes from that section, we said in our paper the conclusions we described above. So again, there's lots of detail here that I'm just skipping over, but this should make the point. Conclusions we describe above on the mechanism by which species originated on the young Earth timescale also naturally explain why limits to speciation exist. So we actually claim to solve that problem. The major fraction of the potential for each kind to speciate was hardwired into each kind from the start, implying that changing one kind into another would require dramatic DNA rewiring of the creature. Hence, our models seem to simultaneously explain the dramatic limited speciation within kinds. In other words, Duff says, we admit we can explain new species, but now we've got this new problem we can't solve. Actually, we show you how we solve the problem and said so in the paper. Yet these guys say, we recognize a new problem and selectively quote from the beginning. And there's the quote as one example. Now let me go back to what Duff said about peer review, because again, he's saying we've got a peer-reviewed article, it increases the accuracy, it's got a long legacy. He says about young Earth creationists, where's the fact checkers? Why do these errors and profound misconceptions of science persist? Serious problem in young Earth creationists, they're being reviewed by non-experts. Yet they make the claim that their work is peer-reviewed. Every single one of his criticisms of young Earth creation science apply to this, but the problem is bigger. 3 authors on this paper, apparently 3 reviewers, and not one of them caught the fact that they've misrepresented what young Earth creationists actually say. Let me take it deeper. I said when Macmillan wrote his article criticizing the paper in 2016, he apparently never bothered to read the abstract. I think it's just clumsy, sloppy research. I'm willing to say that. In this case, I don't think it is. Look at all their references. They're not ignorant of what we say, citing articles from the Ark Encounter, from Tim Chafee and Mike Belknap, who are some of the lead exhibit guys for the Ark Encounter, citing Ken Ham. They're citing Tom Hennigan and Answers Research Journal articles that form the basis for identifying the kinds that we use on board the Ark. Multiple Gene Leitner papers, not just the Answers Research Journal, but the other peer-reviewed papers in Creation Science, Creation Research Society Quarterly, 2 articles by Dave Menton, Henry Morris, John Morris, Gary Parker, John Whitcomb, Roger Patterson, Kurt Wise, several articles, the proceedings of the International Conference on Creationism, the big meetup every several years, Todd Wood, several papers, John Woodmarapi's article on and feasible study on the Ark, a different one of my papers. And of course, the one they say shows even creationists themselves admit they've got an unsolvable problem. So they know what's in the literature, but they refuse to represent it accurately. This is not a question of sloppy research. They're making an argument about problems within the young Earth view, but misrepresenting the data used to justify it. When I was an undergraduate working on plant biology, my professor came to me one day, and he was not a creationist. He said, remember we went to that scientific meeting and so-and-so presented? Yeah, okay. He said, well, he just, this is kind of gossipy, he said, but he just got caught. He had done an experiment, and this was looking at DNA, RNA, some sort of thing like that, and using fluorescent labels to track it, use green and use red. And just to make sure you're not altering the results of the experiment with the specific green and red chemicals you're using, you're supposed to swap them and repeat the experiment. In this case, the details don't matter. The point is, science demands you repeat the experiment and show that the results are still consistent. The guy was lazy. Instead of repeating the experiment, he just copied the results from the first experiment into a second table, and I think reversed the column, and claimed this was experimental results. And someone caught him. A reviewer apparently said, this column is identical to this column. What did you do? And my boss's comment was, he will never get an academic position ever again in his life, because the scientific method depends on honesty. Reviewers can only check what you present. If you misrepresent what you're presenting, you lie about your data, you're banned from science. That's not creationist talking. That's the mainstream community, because everyone knows science doesn't exist unless the honesty is present. You can argue all you want about what the data means and what it doesn't. But if you lie about what you did or what other people did, that's an egregious error. They've tried to claim there's a new problem in creation science by deliberately misrepresenting, apparently, what we actually say. And just again, this is not a personal thing. Why am I camping out on Joel Duff in a paper I cited? Well, just so happens they're taking aim at that, and Joel Duff just so happens to be the leading voice other voices cite as the authority on young Earth creation speciation views. So who do you trust on the question of the origin of species, and how do you explain the other side? You can find more details again in my book, Replacing Darwin, that you can buy through the AIG UK bookstore, or if you're in the US, the Answers in Genesis US bookstore, also on Amazon. I wrote this primarily for students who are evolutionists. I had in mind a college student who grew up default evolutionist. Of course, this is true. I'm not even asking questions about creation science because I don't even bother with that. This is designed to raise questions and then answer them and win a evolutionist to the creationist position. So it gets deep into the weeds at times. I did have a pastor read through it because I said, I want this still to be accessible to the layperson. And he did, and he gave me pointers to help improve it and such. But it's still heavy reading. I like to say it's good. And if you suffer from not being able to fall asleep, you know, just pick up this book and start reading it. It gets a little dry, but it's there. It has to be technical because it's written for people who are skeptics. Replacing Darwin made simple is sort of the Cliff Notes version. Give me the quick answers. How can I, as a Christian, answer these questions? How do species form? Short order, this goes through that. And how then you can use the information to engage evolutionists. So in this book, I don't always give the history of why evolutionists say what they do and why this is significant, because I assume the audience already knows it because they grew up with it. This one I say, okay, here's the history of what evolutionists have said against young Earth creation science. Here's the answer to it, and here's why it's so significant and such a bombshell. That's what this little booklet does. We've also got a 1-hour presentation replacing Darwin. I think it's also now on Answers TV. So put on another plug for Answers TV. Instead of spending lots of money on DVDs, you've got it at your fingertips through a streaming service, answers.tv. You can subscribe to that. So that concludes what I want to say. Again, this is serious news, sad news, because these are the lows to which the leading anti-creationist voices are stooping to make the arguments against young Earth creation science. But I'm going to stop here and take questions and go from there.